So, Chris, today we're talking about a hidden crisis in neonatal and emergency care, specifically relating to community hospitals and some changes that have happened. What patterns have you seen that have connected hospital cost cutting and service consolidation to preventable birth injuries and emergency room tragedies here in Ohio?
Yeah, well, first let me say, John, it's good to see you again and be part of your podcast. I hope you don't mind. Maple, I guess, decided to join us this morning. He's our new office puppy. Yeah, so people that live in the greater Cleveland area are pretty familiar with the fact that over the last 20 to 25 years, the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals have kind of competed with each other, buying up the local community hospitals. And so when people, when I was growing up and, up until about 20 years ago, people were able to get pretty much any hospital service in their own community, short drive from their home. People were able to come and visit them if they were in the hospital. And then, like I said, university and Cleveland Clinic started buying up these community hospitals and also local doctor practices and, funneling all that medical care downtown to their main campuses, which they, as you referred to as consolidation of services, meaning that they were able to then only provide those services at one location. And so now instead of getting the services in your local community, you have to go, down to their downtown campuses and get the care there, which most people wouldn't choose to do. And it has resulted in, it hasn't reduced, costs at all. There's studies that show that, but it also poses a lot of risks to patients.
And what's involved in those risks? Why does that put potential babies and mothers at risk?
Well, the most obvious place where the risks manifest themselves is in the emergency room because people, go to the emergency room because they need care in a hurry. There's a lot of situations where there's a window of time to treat, the condition that somebody might have, like a stroke or a heart attack. I'm sure people have heard phrases like, time is muscle when it comes to a heart attack, meaning the longer, your heart goes without blood, the greater the damage there's going to be to the heart. Same thing with the stroke. Time is brain. Same idea. Your brain goes without oxygen during a stroke. The longer that goes on, the more damage you're going to have. One of the most frequent services that are removed from community hospitals are labor and delivery. And, most of the time, fortunately, labor and delivery goes well, goes smoothly. There's no issues. But when there are problems, baby's not getting enough oxygen during labor, time is of the essence. And the longer somebody waits to provide that care, the more harm can come to the mom and baby.
Right. So if they don't have those services there at that local hospital, then they have to do their best, or they have to transfer them to to another hospital like downtown. Is that what's happening? And then they're losing time because of that transfer to another hospital?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. You've hit exactly on the issue, and that is, a lot of the emergency room doctors that we've taken depositions of don't know the answer to that question. As you said, do their best, and we've taken depositions where doctors said, "Well, yeah, we just tried to do our best." When the services, the equipment, the people that they need to provide specialty care just aren't available in that hospital, and their best, no matter how good it is, isn't going to be good enough because those patients need to be transferred, and they need to be transferred in short order, immediately. And a secondary problem is that, the hospital systems themselves have taken over, the transfer of the patient. So it's not as easy as just calling 911 or calling for an ambulance. They have to go through these, channels, the transfer center at each, these hospital systems have their own transfer center. They have their own vehicles. They have their own personnel. And just like most things in a hospital, it's a big bureaucracy. So, there may be other patients, there may be a problem with vehicle availability. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. In a situation where the hospital systems have consolidated or removed labor and delivery or cardiac care or intensive care from community hospitals, those patients need to be transferred immediately as soon as they get to the emergency room.
What when an expectant mother arrives at a community hospital and she's in distress, what are the specific duties that the hospital has under Ohio and federal law to stabilize or transfer you, and where do you see that duty breaking down?
Yeah, some people are familiar with something called EMTALA, which is sets forth that's the federal law that governs. It basically doesn't allow hospitals to just, if they don't have insurance, to just transfer them out, to some other hospital to quote unquote dump them on another hospital. So it's called EMTALA. It's an anti-dumping statute, but the requirements under the statute are that a qualified medical provider, which is usually the emergency room doctor, or qualified nurse practitioner or physician assistant, would examine the patient to make sure that they're stable, meaning they're not having some kind of crisis or imminent. They're in imminent danger of death or severe injury, and as long as that's not the case, then they can be transferred to another hospital, or so let's just take the case of a mother who comes in that's pregnant and maybe in labor. So labor is not an emergency medical condition, and just because the patient's in labor doesn't mean they can't be transferred. Now, yeah, it can take hours, right? So I mean, so those patients can be transferred. They just have to arrange for in this case, where we're talking about consolidation of services, you just have to call down to the main campus and make sure that there's doctors there that can take care of the patient, that are aware that the patient's going to be coming and are ready for them when they arrive. So that's different than, say the patient's been in labor for hours and then goes to the emergency room and maybe delivery is imminent. There's a presenting part that's, coming through the birth canal, then that's a medical emergency. And then in that situation, they do have to do the best they can to deliver the baby, but then they have to immediately transfer the baby to a hospital where there's a neonatal intensive care unit.
I know my own wife with our first child, was developing preeclampsia before the birth, so her blood pressure was going crazy, spiking, and there was danger to the baby because the baby's heart rate was going down. They had to do an emergency C-section. So, I mean, those types of things could crop up at the last minute too. Like a mother could come in and seem totally fine, and they're just going into labor, and then they notice later that there's some issue, and maybe it's too late to transfer them then, or something like that, right?
Right, that's exactly right. And most people think, well, this isn't something good happen to me, but for your example, it could happen to anybody, and these things, that everything can seem fine. You can have a normal pregnancy, all the way up, and even be in labor and have a normal labor, and things can turn, on a dime, can turn in a minute, and all of a sudden you need emergency, medical care. So I mean, when they take, I don't think I mentioned this yet, but you brought this up. It's a good point. Is that when they take labor and delivery out of hospital to the community hospitals, they also take the neonatal intensive care. So the ability to do emergency C-sections, and then the ability to resuscitate newborn babies if they normally if there's an emergency C-section, the baby's going to need some resuscitation when he or she's born. So all those services are removed at the same time.
So we talked about how those minutes, really matter, especially in these neonatal and cardiac emergencies. How do delays in diagnosis and a lack of on-site specialists and maybe equipment shortages translate into liability for hospital negligence and medical malpractice in Ohio?
Yeah, well, I mean, if patients, if they've consolidated the services, and most hospitals still hold themselves out in the community, most hospital systems hold the community hospital out to the public as, if you look on their website, they say, well, we're first full service hospital, and they list all the services they provide or we can take care of.
Certainly, they say like, "Oh, if you're having an emergency, come to us."
Yeah, exactly right. So one of the things that has to happen is that there have to be policies and procedures in place in the hospital so that the people working there, the doctors and nurses, know which patients have to be transferred and which patients have to be transferred immediately. What's the criteria for an immediate transfer, and they need to know the process, how to transfer the patient, to call the transfer center, how to arrange for the transfer. All those things have to happen. And what we've seen in our cases, we've had both, a labor and birth case, and cardiac cases where, these emergency room doctors aren't hired by the hospital. Most people don't know this, but there's agencies that provide the staffing for emergency rooms for the doctors that are separate from the hospitals. And they work at many different emergency rooms. So when they just, what they call take shifts. So they take shifts, might be at Fairview Hospital one night, 2 or 3 days later, it might be at Parma Hospital, could be at the downtown campus. So they move around. We had a situation where emergency room doctor lived in Columbus and took a shift at a community hospital in Bellevue. And they don't know what services are provided by that hospital. They're not familiar with the policies and procedures. So in the one situation at Bellevue, the person came there with 10 out of 10 chest pain, sweating, all the classic signs and symptoms of a heart attack. Apparently, she didn't realize that they didn't provide cardiac services at that hospital. Instead of transferring this patient right away because the hospital had no capability to care for him, she kept him there for observation for 2 or 3 hours. When the window to get that kind of patient to a cardiac catheterization lab is 90 minutes. And our client ended up suffering a major heart attack. Same thing happened, with the labor and delivery cases. The emergency room doctor worked in 3 or 4 different emergency rooms in the hospital system, and apparently was unaware they didn't have labor and delivery at that hospital. Let the mother, who was clearly, obviously in labor, she doubled over in pain. She left her in the waiting room for an hour and 20 minutes, and then she had a crisis and needed emergency medical care, and it was too late to transfer.
So many families, I'm sure, don't realize that their local hospital has quietly downgraded its NICU or eliminated the NICU or eliminated certain cardiac services. What proactive questions should parents or patients ask, upon arrival in the ER to perhaps protect themselves and their newborns or themselves? And what rights do patients have to request a transfer if they don't think that the hospital that they're currently at is suitable for what their condition is?
Yeah, and there's no reason in most cases for people to suspect, that the hospital no longer has those services because, as we've talked about, they advertise themselves as, full service. Come here in emergency. We provide a full range of care to a full range of patients. From birth to senior care. And most of the advertisements you see, are for the hospital system saying, that will provide excellent care for your, baby. And but in the case of, say a pregnant patient, I mean, that's something to discuss with, if you have a OB that you're seeing regularly, and again, this a lot of times, as was the case with our client, in her practice, OBs, and she was seeing midwives, were rotating or they were leaving the practice, so she didn't really have any continuity of care. But it is something, you should discuss early on in the pregnancy is like, hey, if there's ever an emergency, I live 5 minutes from, this community hospital, can I go there in an emergency? And, so then it would be up to the OB provider, whether it's the doctor or the nurse practitioner, to say, well, no, that community hospital doesn't have labor and delivery services. Here's some around you that do. But like in the case of the heart attack, I mean, there's no reason to be asking ahead of time. Uh, yeah, so I mean, yeah, right, exactly, yeah, right, exactly right. But if you do go, I mean, most people know what the signs of a heart attack are. So, I mean, it'd be, it's worth asking if they have a cardiac catheterization lab. Do they have cardiologists on staff? Can you see a cardiologist? And yeah, you can always ask for a transfer. Problem is they don't always have to transfer you.
So, looking ahead, what policy changes or hospital system reforms would most effectively reduce Ohio birth injury cases and emergency care failures, and how can affected families help to push those reforms forward?
Well, I would say, there's no real good reason to be removing those services from community hospitals. There's been studies that consolidating services don't reduce costs, and they don't improve the quality of care. So there's really no reason to be doing it. So if you live in a community where there is a community hospital, I would do everything you could to fight to save it and to resist any kind of removal of services from there.
Can the public just find out? Can they just call the hospital and say, "Hey, do you have these services? Have these been removed?" Can somebody who wanted to do some activism here, reach out and find out what's going on at their local hospital, and then maybe try to get up some sort of grassroots, thing to try to prevent this from happening or get those services back?
Well, John, I'll be honest with you. They could do that, but I don't know how transparent. I mean, hospitals are not very transparent. My guess is if you did that, you wouldn't really get a straight answer. I mean, obviously you can do the research and see, but that may be beyond what most lay people, can do. Again, I think the best source of information is your personal doctor, your internist, your family doctor, whoever you see regularly to talk about those things with that doctor. That's the best place to get information. I mean, if you just call the hospital, you don't know who you're going to talk to or what they're going to tell you. And I think most of them are pretty guarded. Most people that answer the phone there are pretty guarded as to what their information they're going to give the general public. They'd probably refer you to the website, which again doesn't contain necessarily accurate information.
Any final thoughts to kind of sum this up in terms of what it is that's going on and what potential patients can do to try to prevent any issue?
Well, it's a real issue. It's a real problem. Babies are dying because of this. People are having massive heart attacks because of this. I honestly think people are too accepting when hospitals say, "Oh, well, we have to consolidate services or we have to cut costs." The Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals aren't struggling for make profits. When they come out with the highest paid CEOs, those the CEO of Cleveland Clinic and CEO of university hospitals are always at the top of the list. And below them, there's also a whole, layers and layers of management people that are, making profits, and yet we're taking services out of the communities where, that's patients are best served by getting care locally. So, yeah, I mean, I wish I had the answers. I don't, but I know it's an issue. I think holding the hospitals accountable, when mistakes happen, when babies die, when people die from heart attacks because they didn't get the care they needed because it wasn't at that hospital and they were left sitting in that hospital. I think if you hold hospitals accountable for that, eventually they'll get the message and bring the services back.